the success. My belief of this induces me to hope, though I must not presume, that the same goodness will still be exercised toward me in continuing that happiness or enabling me to bear a fatal reverse, which I may experience as others have done, the complexion of my future fortune being known to Him only in whose power it is to bless us even in our afflictions. Some notes which one of my uncles, who had the same curiosity in collecting family anecdotes, once put into my hands, furnished me with several particulars relative to our ancestors. From these notes I learned that they lived in the same village, Ecton, in Northamptonshire, on a freehold of about 30 acres for at least 300 years, and how much longer could not be ascertained. This small estate would not have sufficed for their maintenance without the business of a smith, which had continued in the family down to my uncle's time, the eldest son being always brought up in that employment, a custom which he and my father followed with regard to their eldest sons. When I searched the register at Ecton, I found an account of their marriages and burials from the year 1555 only, as the registers kept did not commence previous thereto. I, however, learned from it that I was the youngest son of the youngest son for 5 generations back. My grandfather Thomas, who was born in 1598, lived at Ecton until he was too old to continue his business, when he retired to Banbury in Oxfordshire to the house of his son John, with whom my father served an apprenticeship. There my uncle died and lies buried. We saw his gravestone in 1758. His eldest son, Thomas, lived in the house of Ecton and left it with the land to his only daughter, who with her husband, one Fisher of Wellingborough, sold it to Mr. Eisted, now lord of the manor there. My grandfather had 4 sons who grew up. They were Thomas, John, Benjamin, and Josiah. Being at a distance from my papers, I will give you what account I can of them from memory, and if my papers are not lost in my absence, you'll find among them many more particulars. Thomas, my eldest uncle, was bred a smith under his father, but being ingenious and encouraged in learning, as all my brothers were, by an Esquire Palmer, then the principal inhabitant of that parish, he qualified himself for the bar, and became a considerable man in the county. He was chief mover of all public-spirited enterprises for the county or town of Northampton, as well as of his own village, of which many instances were related of him, and he was much taken notice of and patronized by Lord Halifax. He died in 1702 on the 6th of January, 4 years to the day before I was born. The recital which some elderly persons made to us of his character, I remember, struck you as something extraordinary for its similarity to what you knew of me. Had he died, said you, 4 years later on the same day, one might have supposed a transmigration. John, my next uncle, was bred a dyer, I believe of wool. Benjamin was bred a silk dyer, serving an apprenticeship in London. He was an ingenious man. I remember when I was a boy he came to my father's in Boston and resided in the house with us for several years. There was always a particular affection between my father and him, and I was his godson. He lived to a great age. He left behind him 2 quarto volumes of manuscript of his own poetry, consisting of fugitive pieces addressed to his friends. He had invented a shorthand of his own, which he taught me, but not having practiced it, I've now forgotten it. He was very pious, and an assiduous attendant at the sermons of the best preachers, which he reduced to writing according to his method, and had thus collected several volumes of them. He was also a good deal of a politician, too much so, perhaps, for his station. There fell lately into my hands in London a collection he made of all the principal political pamphlets relating to public affairs from the year 1641 to 1717. Many of the volumes are wanting, as appears by their numbering, but there still remain 8 volumes in folio, and 20 in quarto and in octavo. A dealer in old books had met with them, and knowing me by name, having bought books of him, he brought them to me. It would appear that my uncle must have left them here when he went to America, which was about 50 years ago. I found several of his notes in the margins. His grandson Samuel Franklin is still living in Boston. Our humble family early embraced the Reformed religion. Our forefathers continued Protestants through the reign of Mary, when they were sometimes in danger of prosecution on account of their zeal against popery. They had an English Bible, and to conceal it and place it in safety, it was fastened open with tapes under and within the cover of a joint stool. When my great-grandfather wished to read it to his family, he placed the joint stool on his knees, and then turned over the leaves under the tapes. One of the children stood at the door to give notice if he saw the apparitor coming, who was an officer of the spiritual court. In that case, the stool was turned down again upon its feet, when the Bible remained concealed under it as before. This anecdote I had from Uncle Benjamin. The family continued all of the Church of England till about the end of Charles II's reign, when some of the ministers that had been outed for their nonconformity holding conventicles in Northamptonshire, my Uncle Benjamin and Father Josiah adhered to them, and so continued all their lives. The rest of the family remained with the Episcopal Church. My father married young, and carried his wife with 3 children to New England about 1685. The conventicles being at that time forbidden by law, and frequently disturbed in their meetings, some considerable men of his acquaintance determined to go to that country, and he was prevailed with to accompany them thither, where they expected to enjoy the exercise of their religion with freedom. By the same wife my father had 4 children more born there, and by a second wife 10 others, in all 17, of whom I remember to have seen 13 sitting together at his table, who all grew up to years of maturity and were married. I was the youngest son, and the youngest of all the children except 2 daughters. I was born in Boston, in New England. My mother, the second wife of my father, was Abiah Folger, daughter of Peter Folger, one of the first settlers of New England, of whom honorable mention is made by Cotton Mather in his ecclesiastical history of that country entitled Magnalia Christi Americana as a godly and learned Englishman, if I remember the words rightly. I was informed he wrote several small occasional works, but only one of them was printed, which I remember to have seen several years since. It was written in 1675. It was in familiar verse according to the taste of the times and people, and addressed to the government there. It asserts the liberty of conscience in behalf of the Anabaptists, the Quakers, and other sectaries that had been persecuted. He attributes to this persecution the Indian Wars, and other calamities that had befallen the country, regarding them as so many judgments of God to punish so heinous an offense, and exhorting the repeal of those laws so contrary to charity. This piece appeared to me as written with manly freedom and a pleasing simplicity. The last 6 lines I remember, but have forgotten the preceding ones of the stanza. The purport of them was that his censors proceeded from goodwill, and therefore he would be known to be the author. "Because to be a libeller," said he, "I hate it with my heart. From Sherborne town, where now I dwell, my name I do put here. Without offense, your real friend, it is Peter Folger." My elder brothers were all put apprentices to different trades. I was put to the grammar school at 8 years of age, my father intending to devote me, as the tithe of his sons, to the service of the church. My early readiness in learning to read, which must have been very early, as I do not remember when I could not read, and the opinion of all my friends that I should certainly make a good scholar, encouraged him in this purpose of his. My Uncle Benjamin, too, approved of it, and proposed to give me his shorthand volumes of sermons to set up with if I would learn his shorthand. I continued, however, at the grammar school rather less than a year, though in that time I had risen gradually from the middle of the class of that year to be at the head of the same class, and was removed into the next class, whence I was to be placed in the third at the end of the year. But my father, burdened with a numerous family, was unable without inconvenience to support the expense of a college education. Considering, moreover, as he said to one of his friends in my presence, the little encouragement that line of life afforded to those educated for it, he gave up his first intentions, took me from the grammar school, and sent me to a school for writing and arithmetic kept by a then famous man, Mr. George Brownwell. He was a skillful master and successful in his profession, employing the mildest and most encouraging methods. Under him I learned to write a good hand pretty soon, but failed entirely in arithmetic. At 10 years old I was taken to help my father in his business, which was that of a tallow chandler and soap boiler, a business to which he was not bred, but had assumed on his arrival in New England because he found that his dyeing trade, being in little request, would not maintain his family. Accordingly, I was employed in cutting wicks for the candles, filling the molds for cast candles, attending the shop, going of errands, etc. I disliked the trade and had a strong inclination to go to sea, but my father declared against it. But residing near the water, I was much in it and on it. I learned to swim well and to manage boats, and when embarked with other boys I was commonly allowed to govern, especially in any case of difficulty. And upon other occasions I was generally the leader among the boys, and sometimes led them into scrapes, of which I will mention one instance, as it shows an early projecting public spirit, though not then justly conducted. There was a salt marsh, which bounded part of the mill pond, on the edge of which, at high water, we used to stand to fish for minnows. By much trampling we had made it a mere quagmire. My proposal was to build a wharf there for us to stand upon. I showed my comrades a large heap of stones which were intended for a new house near the marsh, and which would very well suit our purpose. Accordingly, in the evening, when the workmen were gone home, I assembled a number of my playfellows, and we worked diligently like so many emmets, sometimes 2 or 3 to a stone, till we had brought them all to make our little wharf. The next morning the workmen were surprised at missing the stones which formed our wharf. Inquiry was made after the authors of this transfer. We were discovered, complained of, and corrected by our fathers. And though I demonstrated the utility of our work, mine convinced me that that which was not honest could not be truly useful. I suppose you may like to know what kind of man my father was. He had an excellent constitution, was of middle stature, well set, and very strong. He could draw prettily, and was skilled a little in music. His voice was sonorous and agreeable, so that when he played on his violin and sung withal, as he was accustomed to do after the business of the day was over, it was extremely agreeable to hear. He had some knowledge of mechanics, and on occasion was very handy with other tradesmen's tools, but his great excellence was his sound understanding and solid judgment in prudential matters, both in private and public affairs. It's true he was never employed in the latter, the numerous family he had to educate and the straightness of his circumstances keeping him close to his trade. But I remember well his being frequently visited by leading men who consulted him for his opinion in public affairs and those of the church he belonged to, and who showed a great respect for his judgment and advice. He was also much consulted by private persons about their affairs when any difficulty occurred, and frequently chosen an arbitrator between contending parties. At his table he liked to have, as often as he could, some sensible friend or neighbor to converse with, and always took care to start some ingenious or useful topic for discourse, which might tend to improve the minds of his children. By this means he turned our attention to what was good, just, and prudent in the conduct of life, and little or no notice was ever taken of what related to the victuals on the table, whether it was well or ill-dressed, in or out of season, of good or bad flavor, preferable or inferior to this or that other thing of this kind, so that I was brought up in such a perfect inattention to those matters as to be quite indifferent what kind of food was set before me. Indeed, I'm so unobservant of it that to this day I can scarce tell a few hours after dinner of what dishes it consisted. This has been a great convenience to me in traveling, where my companions have been sometimes very unhappy for want of a suitable gratification of their more delicate, because better instructed, tastes and appetites. My mother had likewise an excellent constitution. She suckled all her 10 children. I never knew either my father or mother to have any sickness but that of which they died, he at 89 and she at 85 years of age. They lie buried together at Boston, where I some years since placed a marble over their grave with this inscription: Josiah Franklin and Abiah his wife lie here interred. They lived lovingly together in wedlock 55 years. And without an estate or any gainful employment, by constant labor and honest industry, with God's blessing, maintained a large family comfortably, and brought up 13 children and 7 grandchildren reputably. From this instance, reader, be encouraged to diligence in thy calling, and distrust not providence. He was a pious and prudent man, she a discreet and virtuous woman. Their youngest son, in filial regard to their memory, places this stone.